like we got 9 or 10 people. And then I think the goal of this is it'll evolve over time. I'm hoping to bring in some different people and, kind of like Kedrick's doing now, co-host or maybe even like me let other people run it. Because it just gives people an opportunity to, interpret the science and kind of think about it a little bit more when you have to present it or talk about it on camera. But anyway, I do appreciate you joining, Kedrick. And today we're going
Pleasure's
to
mine.
cover what?
Pleasure's mine.
Oh, you still is Taylor about to go?
No.
Anyway, so today we're going to be talking about Carroll et al. And so this is a group out of East Tennessee State University. Mike Stone is the kind of last author on this, and he's well known in the exercise field for kind of researching periodization and different forms of it, and a lot of sports science. He's basically a big shot in the field. This is Kevin Carroll's paper, and so what he wanted to do was compare repetition maxes with relative intensity, and then look at kind of the physiological outcomes that occur. Now, as a coach, right, some of you probably use rep maxes or RPE or reps in reserve or something. And so this is basically testing that type of system against a relative intensity system. So what, off the top of your head, what kind of systems do you use mostly, Kedrick, for your athletes and yourself?
Well, usually it's a combination of both. I mean, I do use like say percentage wise, right? So I mean, if you look at repetition max, I would assume that repetition maximum in the paper at least says that you go to failure, whereas relative intensity, multiple ways to interpret it, but for this paper they use relative intensity shy of failure. So I mean, I do use percentage, but in a way it can also be considered like relative intensity, but in conjunction with that, I give a RPE point for them to meet, right? Or at least a cap. So I typically don't increase the load to meet the RPE within the training day. If that load, if it's an RPE of 6 or like RPE of 5, I think, wow, that's great, right? Then I could use that information and probably make a bigger jump next week, right? Because I find that from the practical point of view, people do get over ambitious sometimes. If you say, right, if the load is not met, you can increase the load. People would make big jumps and big leaps just because they want to. Sometimes it's for the gram, sometimes it's to fuel the ego, or sometimes it could just be misinformed, like they thought they felt they could do this much, but in the end they couldn't. So I generally like to be a little bit more conservative. Well, yeah, that's just
Yeah,
the
yeah.
rule of thumb for myself.
So basically, what you're comparing here is the kind of a known maximum, which to do properly, you have to max, versus a perceived, or even in this case, a failure of mechanical motion. So it's quite different. And like you said, with the reps in reserve system that a lot of people use, it's more about how you're feeling that day or how the loads are. Whereas when you have percentages, it's just, all right, you're supposed to go in and hit 75%. You go in, you hit it. Doesn't really matter about how it felt. So you need to retest yourself more frequently. Now, they set this up not necessarily to test like a powerlifter or a physique athlete, but more like a sport athlete. And when you look at their subjects, it's a great place to start, right? They were really well trained, so they're like 7 years of training. They're about 27 years old and 86 kilos. So they were pretty good sized dudes, and it was all males. And so just taking that into account, you're like, okay, well, I'm probably working with graduate students or people who have at least been training for quite a while. And if you look at their mid thigh pulls in this paper and the other one, they were also pretty dang strong. Um, so a good group of people to test this on. But going into it, when I was reading this paper, I was like, okay, how much of a difference is 10 weeks going to make in someone who's been training for 7 years, right? So then I'm thinking, okay, well, it's not going to be that much. And they only had, 7 or 8 people per group, which is not bad for sports science. More is always better to an extent. But it's within reason, I think. Um, Now, when you looked at so looking at table one, you look at the resistance training program. It's again typical block periodization, right? Strength endurance, max strength. They have an overreach and then a speed strength. Now, I'm kind of curious in design aspect where or why they put this overreach before the speed strength. Do you have any ideas about maybe why they did that?
To be honest,
And,
I mean, I would personally think that just because the test, right? I would say usually for powerlifting, we usually put the test the last training block to replicate the test as much as
Mhm.
possible. So I'm not familiar with like other form of testing methods. I wouldn't call myself an expert in like the general testing that sports science uses, like uh,
Yeah.
compared to powerlifting. But I would say that because I know that power is quite a transient quality, right? So you can gain power really quick, and you can also lose power really fast as well. So looking at the vertical jump, it's more of like a power test. I
Mhm.
think it kind of makes sense to have a little bit speed strength there, and the the, 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 the speed component probably plays a big role in helping with like vertical jump or at least power expression, whereas the strength would help with the mid thigh pull thing. It could just be pure speculation on my end.
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
say
No,
that.
no, I would agree with you 100%. After you're saying that, like, it makes sense to have the last block, and again, they're emulating sports here, which the last block is usually a speed strength block, um, and to almost let them kind of come down a little bit from that overreach before testing them, because if they're overreached and you test them, it's probably not ideal scenario, right?
Yep.
Um, And they do have a 2 week taper in there, which lets them recover appropriately. And I think you don't often see that in this type of literature. But again, I don't think there are any like major flaws in the design. I think for the purposes of, hey, we want to test people like athletes, this is great. Um, so I guess we'll just kind of keep that in mind when you're interpreting, everybody who's listening and watching and stuff, when you're interpreting what they're trying to do. So moving on to table two, they just have all of their training, right? And it's a pretty typical training program. There's not a ton of exercises, which is kind of nice, honestly. Um, they have, back squat, overhead press, bench, all the typical stuff you would see. And there's about 4 to 5 exercises per session, 3 days a week training. Um, and guys like this were probably training at least 3 days a week. So if I just had to assume, I'd say, okay, well, this is at least what they were doing. Might be more. Um, and so the thing that I don't love here, especially in terms of practical purposes, is the changing of the accessory exercises and the things that may not really matter um, over time. So, like the squat looks like the close grip pulls and the bench presser throughout, but they seemed to change some other things a little bit along the way. And I think that goes with their block periodization, but I just don't love that from a practical standpoint. Did you have anything you wanted to add on the training table basically of what they're doing?
Yeah, just going through the methods again, looking at the sites that they sample for. It seems that the biopsy was only done on the vastus lateralis, right? So
Yeah.
I would say, you know, hypertrophy was only measured at like the lower body. Not sure, like I say, and even the isometric mid thigh pull and the vertical jump is a very lower body dominant test, right?
Mhm.
Compared to whatever they've been doing. So I'm just wondering how or why. What is the rationale for having either having the
That.
bench press or like upper body work in without testing it,
Mhm.
or yeah, like, or why, like,
Yeah.
if they had it in, why didn't they test it? Or the question could be, if they don't plan to test it, why did they have it in? So like that's a question that I have, but might not be uh, like say that relevant, but it's just something I think about when I look at the study design.
Yeah, no, and that makes great sense. It's like, okay, well, we have the capability to do an ultrasound, um, and a anatomical cross section, which means a kind of like a moving ultrasound. Um, so that leads you to believe, well, maybe there's either another paper coming, or um, they just you can only do so much sometimes. And they were like, well, if we're going to biopsy the thigh and do all of our measurements in the thigh, and that's pretty typical. Maybe we don't need to, for example, do an ultrasound on the biceps or the back or something else that might change. Those are a lot more difficult to ultrasound anyway. But I will say that they had really, really good like repeatability in their tests with their measurements, which was nice to see. So that was pretty cool. But I guess moving on to just the outcomes, right? So they had, um, let's see, where do we want to start with outcomes? You can pick if you would like. Otherwise,
I mean,
just
they they primarily looked at uh, this was just like say adaptations at the fiber level, which to be honest, it's very much uh, in your area of expertise compared to mine. So you
yeah,
you probably
you know,
could start with that.
yeah, for sure. So if you've never seen or taken or given a biopsy, they basically stick a needle in your leg, they pull out a piece of muscle, they put it on a cork, and then to get this very pretty image on, I think it's page 5, it's actually quite a nice image. You can stain the muscle section with different myosin heavy chains to give you your type 1 and type 2 and type 2A and X fibers. So they did that, and what did they find? Oh man, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, so they found when they looked across the board, only the relative intensity group showed a significant change pre to post for type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers. Now, when they ran their stats, they did something kind of interesting. They did their omnibus test, so they looked and said, "Is there any differences in our ANOVA? So is there any difference anywhere?" And then you can run a what they call a post hoc test, and basically figure out where that difference is. So when you look at Figure 3, that difference occurred in the pre to post change, that indicated that little star. Um, and that's how they could say, there was a significant change in the relative intensity group for type 1 and type 2 fibers. So they got bigger, right? But they didn't find the same thing in the rep maximum group. And if you look at the graphs, you're like, okay, well, there's not a huge change going on there. Um, In the type 2 fibers, you would expect them to hypertrophy more. So that kind of makes sense, and they do. And the baselines are mostly the same. But I think the important thing to remember here is they really didn't find a difference between groups, right? So all they're saying is one of the groups improved pre to post. They both improved about the same amount, but there were no significant differences between them. And since it's a small study, you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. Now they do effect sizes, which is a whole nother can of worms, and they show indeed the relative intensity is much better. But maybe kind of moving on to the anatomical cross-sectional area, you see very similar results. So you have your relative intensity increased a little bit in the post-test. The muscle thickness, kind of the same thing. And what figure 3 and 4 basically say is, to me at least, it's, we're finding a change pre to post, which is good, right? 10 to 12 weeks of training should do that. But I don't know if they have enough subjects to really say, hey, there's a big difference or a significant one between these two training program styles. So I guess, how did you feel about this whole like figure 3, figure 4? Is there anything you wanted to add? But that was just kind of like my take on it is, this is cool data and I appreciate it, but it's not super duper convincing, at least figure 3 and 4.
I mean, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this is just really at like the fiber level, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure how much. I mean, if you're trying to at it from a practical point of view, I'm not even sure how much real world changes there would be. You know.
Yeah. And again, these are really, really well trained people. So you wouldn't expect, like, if I said, hey, Kedrick, I'm going to put you on a 12-week training program and you're going to gain 500 microns in cross sectional area and 5 centimeters in anatomical area and, half a centimeter in muscle thickness, you would probably be like, sweet, that sounds great. Let's do it. um, so relating this to the global scale, I struggle a little bit with these smaller studies, but again, this is the first one to compare the two methods really. So you got to start
Yep.
somewhere,
Yep.
and I think
100%.
that's important to keep in mind. Now they did Western blots and stuff, but and I applaud that because they're difficult to do. But they didn't really find anything, and when I review papers, if there's negative results, I kind of like, I'm glad you did that, but that doesn't tell me a whole lot unless, in this case, you're just telling me there's no differences. The caveat with this study is when they took their muscle biopsies, they were about 48 to 72 hours after the last training section. So that's great for muscle swelling, right? So they probably are past that window, probably. But for signaling, for like muscle signaling, that's too late. You can't really do a whole lot at that time point. Everything's kind of acute, right? So if you think of muscle protein synthesis, uh, mTOR, phosphorylation, AMPK, everything is in the first, 12 to maybe 24 hours, where you see those peaks and you can kind of say, oh, this is what's happening. So I think in this case, I would rather have what they did was the later time points, but the later biopsies, than have maybe muscle swelling influence the uh, other results. So I'm okay with that, but there's nothing really exciting there for me. But I guess we can go. So that's basically the study in a nutshell. Um, is there anything that you wanted to cover specifically, or maybe we should jump to the questions?
I mean, yeah, you could probably go to questions, and I mean, if I think about something halfway, I'll I'll just
Yeah.
yeah, we'll just cover it then.
Yeah, so one thing they didn't report, and they say this is a limitation, is the nutrition, right?
Yep.
So I feel like nowadays that's not too hard to do. You just teach people how to use MyFitnessPal, and at least you have something, even if it's like a 3-day diet log. Uh, but I think they said somewhere there that like body weight didn't change, and so you're like,
Yep.
okay, well, that doesn't tell me a whole lot. I would have liked to see that because I do think it can influence the results, especially if you have um, one or two people kind of pulling the groups because there's only 7 or 8.
Yep.
You could say, hey, maybe you're not an outlier, but you were in a 1,000 calorie deficit for 10
Yep.
weeks or something. So that's one reason to include individual data points, but again, can't do everything. Uh, Someone asked for like the training logs, and I, I think that would be really cool if researchers had to kind of like hand over their training logs because they definitely
Yep.
have them, but I've never seen anyone ever do that, and I don't think anyone ever will. I think it's just like, that might be too much to ask.
Yep.
Um, let's see. I think Richard brought up that there was actually like a typo in their graphs and their tables, and I think he's right. I think if you look at it's like the fourth or fifth comment down, um, they report muscle thickness post is 3.62 centimeters squared in the table, and then in the graph it looks like it's 2.62. But that kind of stuff happens. I don't know that that's a huge deal. I'm gonna say, based on their results, that the table is the correct data, and something funky happened somewhere else. Okay. The next question was on sprint training, which I think is a great question. They they did some sprint training because they're trying to emulate these
Yep.
athletes, right? And
Yep.
so I looked at the other paper that I put up a little bit late, but um, it said that they did 2 to 3 sets of three 20-meter sprints. So I did three 20-meter sprints, 2 to 3 sets of those, 2 minutes of rest between each set, and 4 minutes of rest between sets. Yeah, I'm not sure. The wording on that's a little bit off, but it doesn't sound like they did a ton of sprints. They did enough to say, hey, you're an athlete, and I don't think it really affect training too much. But given that one group was going to failure on their last set, it may have been enough to push someone over the edge, maybe.
Yep.
And I don't think as a coach or bodybuilder myself, I would go do sprints on my off days, but some people might want to. Um, how do you feel about sprints, man?
I you have to re-invite me to the thing because I'm hearing like double voices now. So I would leave it. I'll leave and come back. Give me a second.
Okay, let's see. While he's going, does anybody else have any questions? Um, I think that we covered everything. Jacob asked where I got his hoodie from, and this is, uh, my Strength Guys hoodie. It's all of like 67 degrees in Birmingham, Alabama, so not too cold. Um, and again, we'll open words so that you can watch it, you can ask questions. The purpose of this is you see a lot of experts, right, who analyze studies, they post summaries, they explain very well how they got to where they got. But ultimately, if you can read a study, you're much better off. Now, not everybody has the time to do that. I don't think that everybody should do that, but I wanted to give an opportunity for people to learn how to think a little bit. So if you have any other ideas to help enhance that, that's like shoot me a message, or if you wanted to jump in, you could totally do that. But other than that, this is kind of like an ongoing process where we will test some things out, but just see how it goes. So let's see if Kedrick is back yet. Let's see. I think he's back. Yeah, and he's back.
All right, sweet. So what did I miss? You talked about sprint training a bit, right?
Yeah. So that was kind of it. Just throwing in there that we probably wouldn't sprint if we were doing this type of training ourselves.
Yep.
But I think we covered most things. Is there anything else you wanted to cover?
Yeah, I think regarding the kind of like the sprint training, a large part at least would be we do know like when we do stuff for sprint training, it's considered like under concurrent training, right? So we do see that on a concurrent training point of view, I would say that if you're not going to failure, doing concurrent training or like sprint training, especially because sprint training kind of like replicates the resistance training adaptation, could actually be synergistic towards resistance training gains. But the group that has already trained to failure, like every single time, you would actually think that the additional sprint training would actually be way it's like additional load that they can't recover from, which could potentially blunt adaptation, because when we look at concurrent training wise, it's not really what you do, but how much of what you do, right? So like, if you run a marathon after you freaking lift weights, you're definitely going to see some interference in terms of adaptation. So that could be really could be one of the factors that played a role in the whole group, that right? Why did one group actually gain more muscle, at least showed from fiber specific muscle compared to the other group? This could be, if you don't train as hard in one training intervention, the additional training stress might potentially be beneficial. But if you're already training to failure, additional stress is detrimental. So that could be one thing to keep in mind as well for those that are like listening.
Yeah, for sure. And so I always like to think, what is the next step in these studies? What would you like to see the next study be? Or what would you do maybe different, and or what would help build this story? How do we figure out which is better, intensity or rep max?
I would honestly say if they are looking at hypertrophic adaptation, they have to design a training block for hypertrophy, because this is not a hypertrophy study at all. I mean, if you look at it, right, the last block of training is literally 3 sets of 2, right? Like, tell me, like, how, like, when was the last time you heard a bodybuilder do 3 sets of 2 of anything at all?
Never.
Right?
Never.
Like, yeah. So I'm not even sure like what is the minimum level of threshold you would require that is required to be met to maintain like hypertrophic adaptation, or to even or even from a signaling point of view to maintain whatever happens in the muscle cell itself, considering the fact that one, the repetition range is so small, that the workload is so small. I would assume that because it's also a speed strength block, mechanical tension imposed on the muscle itself would be less, right? I mean, you look at power, like, or ballistic movements, you do get the mechanical tension isn't that high compared to like the traditional hypertrophic within the hypertrophic rep range, right? I mean, quote unquote, because there is no hypertrophic rep range per se, but like, yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so it's just, I think if you want to look at hypertrophy as a specific adaptation, the training block should actually support the adaptation you're trying to seek, and then we can say that, hey, maybe there's something there. But right now you're just I would say the hypertrophic measures are just like, yeah, we just analyze it. It's a bonus if we even detect something or not. So that is what I'm getting from it.
Yeah.
Because they did do a study. I mean, this is the second part of the study, where the first part they look at performance outcomes, and sure, the performance outcomes actually show an improvement, which makes sense. I mean, if you fail all the time, fatigue actually masks your performance, which makes kind of makes sense. But when it comes to hypertrophy, the training block doesn't really support hypertrophic adaptations. So it's more like a secondary outcome that they analyze.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think if you're curious about hypertrophy outcomes, you do, all hypertrophy blocks. Their other paper did show strength differences. I can't remember off the top of my head if there were any group differences. But the other thing they found in the study was the so Colby mentions it, and it's the stress. So basically, the repetition maximum group had more stress, which may make it, like you mentioned, more difficult to recover from. And I think that's important, but I don't know if it matters as much just because of the taper.
Could you repeat the comment, because I can't read comments from my side for some weird reason. So
Oh no, so
I can't see it. Yeah.
Yeah, so Colby just said that it was interesting, and we want to know what we thought about the stress difference in the groups. So there's greater stress in the repetition maximum group. And I might be making that whole taper idea up. I may have mixed up my studies. But anyway, I think it does play a role, and it's mostly in uncovering that physiological fatigue that we see. With hypertrophy, I don't know if it matters as much. With strength, it definitely does. With hypertrophy, as long as you're not measuring, I don't know. I think there's something else there. So I think I like that comment, but I don't know what it is. So I'll be honest.
Yeah. I mean, when we look at like a study by Moran Navarro in 2017, where they look at time course of recovery, they actually showed like whether you go to failure or not, the acute, right? At least the acute measures in the first like 7 to 9 or 7 to 10 weeks, I can't remember how long the study was done, was very similar. So in like they did the failure versus stopping to 5 to 9 RPE probably result in similar hypertrophy adaptations when the volumes match. So I would say that maybe like even the stress wise, for like say for hypertrophy might not play a big outcome, because at the end of the day you need, especially in the short term, right? Like you need some form of like stress and fatigue to drive the hypertrophic adaptation. But it's more of like if you're constantly having high stress and high fatigue, your subsequent blocks would be less effective. So perhaps in the short term, it might not be as important for hypertrophy specifically. But yeah, I mean, for other adaptations, I would say definitely play a role. Definitely one for power and strength bigger than hypertrophy.
Yeah. So I think if we don't have any other questions, I just didn't want to make it too long this first time. We will wrap there. Post any other questions you have or answers to the questions below in the comments. I'll save the video. Think about coming on, and I'll post a new poll soon with papers to choose from, and we will do it again in about a little over 2 weeks, I think. A little under 2 weeks. But I think this went really well. So leave feedback or shoot me a message if you're listening or watching at some point on what we can improve and what you liked or didn't like. But thank you, Kedrick, my temporary co-host.
No worries. I think we should. I mean, Greg and Eric Traxler really used the title temporary co-host. I think we should use it like the opposite, like permanent invited guest or something like that, just to make sure that we are not plagiarizing it. Because I know Eric Traxler gets angry at Eric Helms for plagiarizing his name. So we don't want to get in their bad shoes, especially especially since you've actually been on their podcast, they might label you as a spy, right? So we want to avoid all of that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, again, appreciate it, guys, and we will talk to you next time.
Right? See you guys.